This class is about making more plants. The plants we're going to look at here in this garden mostly have medicinal use, and I'll also say every plant has medicinal use. One thing I've been taught is to never assume that everybody knows the same words. And I've had people ask me to explain, because I will definitely use the words annual, biennial, and perennial, which it may be that there's various meanings for those words. I only know pretty narrow meanings of each one when we're talking about plants. An annual plant, when I'm talking about it, means a plant that grows and dies from seed the same year. It might not be the same calendar year. The seed might germinate in the autumn and it might die in the summer, but it's something that lives for 12 months or less. And then biennial is a plant that lives for some period of time that's between 12 months and 24 months. So biennial means 2 years. And a perennial is a plant that lives for more than 2 years, which could be an old growth Doug fir that lives for 1,000 years, or it could be some herb in your garden that lives for 5 years. There's 2 categories of propagation that I want to talk about. Oh, I should use the hot pink to write sexual. Sexual propagation means propagation from seeds. And the reason that we propagate a plant from seeds, it would be one of 2 reasons. One would be that is the only way that this plant can propagate itself. And the other would be if you want more genetic diversity, because sexual propagation creates genetic diversity. The other broad category, and so seeding is the only kind of sexual propagation, and we'll do that first. The other broad category is making new plants from any other part of the plant that is not a seed, which is called either asexual or vegetative, which means using any part of the plant that is not a seed, which could be the stem, it could be the roots. There are some plants that you can take a leaf and stick it in the ground and it'll make a new plant. So we're going to talk about seeding, and then we're going to talk about a couple different kinds of vegetative propagation. So those are the 2 jargon categories that I wanted to clarify. Now we're going to talk about seeding, and the first thing we're going to do is walk over to that goldenrod plant and collect some seeds from it. The way that I like to collect them is I take a paper bag and I stick it over the plant and shake it. And you might notice I'm also shaking seeds onto the ground. There's probably going to be a bunch of baby goldenrod plants coming up next year.
I guess a question around seeds is, when do you know that they're fully developed?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, it depends on the plant. Oh, sorry, plant, I broke your stem, but you'll be fine. In the case of this plant, I can tell because they're completely dry. There are these little dry pom-poms here that are falling off by themselves. That doesn't mean that every one of them will be viable. There's probably lots and lots of non-viable dried flowers that either don't have a seed at all or have a thing that kind of looks like a seed but isn't going to grow. But it's making so many seeds that there's probably lots of viable ones. Plants that have a fleshy fruit, then the seed is mature when the fruit is fully ripe and starting to decompose. But in the case of most of these kinds of plants, it's when the seed itself or the flower seems to be totally dried out. But it is going to be a little bit different from every species. So I got a lot of these tiny little seeds in this bag, and we'll actually go back over there and seed them. Dump the seeds in this bowl. And this is an opportunity for hands-on practice if anybody wants to, but no pressure. But that's why there's all these pots and all the soil. Thank you and Pastor Roll for having them. This is a wild native plant. One thing that I don't know by looking at it is whether that particular goldenrod is the one that's native to this bioregion, because I don't know what the native one looks like, as you can tell, since I couldn't even remember. But what is true of all goldenrods is that they have these tiny, tiny seeds. And so one good rule of thumb with planting seeds is that the bigger the seed is, the deeper you plant it, and vice versa. So this seed is very, very small. It would be hard to plant just one, and because plants that are more wild, as I said, it's more likely that there will be a lot of seeds that don't germinate. That's going to be true of cultivated vegetables also. There'll be lots of seeds that don't germinate. And there's lots and lots and lots of seeds. This is just what I got from that one branch, and it's, you know, hundreds of seeds in this bowl. So the easiest way to plant them is just take a pinch and sprinkle. And wow, yeah, those things, I do see some things that look like seeds. Do a little extra
seed coat.
just to be, because mostly what I'm seeing is the dried flowers. What you can see is I'm putting a lot of this in the pot because it's so hard to tell which of the dried flowers actually has a viable seed. There's definitely some things there that look like seeds to me. I'm not going to cover them up because they're so tiny, and this particular genus, so genus is larger and then there are species within a genus. So the genus Solidago, which is all the goldenrods, all of them have these tiny seeds, and all of them, the seeds need sun to germinate. And so instead of covering them, I'm just going to press them. And then there's two ways that I like to water seeds that are this tiny. One would be with the mist setting on the sprayer, which we could go over there and demonstrate. But I think the thing I do want to demonstrate, this is one of the things I learned from my mentor, Scotty Fairchild, is to not disturb the seeds by soaking them from the bottom. And so the soil is not bone dry. It's quite moist, but it's not wet. And those seeds are going to need some moisture. So in the wild, what happens is the seeds fall on the ground, and then at some point it rains, and then at some point the seed germinates. And that's going to be true of any plant that isn't being deliberately tended by humans, which is not to say that that plant isn't being tended, but, and when we say wild, that's also, I mean, it's a colonized term, but there are places where there are plants that are not being tended by humans, and there are also places that us white folks might think that the plants aren't being tended, but it's only because it's a different kind of tending than we know. There definitely are places where the plants are on their own, and they seem to be able to grow themselves some new plants without help from humans. It's pretty cool. So if I leave this here, it will get rained on, which is usually much gentler than anything that we do with a hose other than the mist setting. But also, if I leave it here in this tub of water, it is going to wick the moisture up through the soil from the water, and the seeds will get moistened that way. It usually takes at least a couple hours. The drier the soil is, the longer it's going to take. The other special need for this particular plant, which is true of some plants, true of many plants, but not all, is that the seeds will only germinate after they experience something that feels like winter. If you hear people in the horticulture world talking about it, you might hear them say cold stratification. The important thing to know is not the terminology. The important thing to know is what the plants need. And so if we leave this pot outside, it'll experience winter. It also might experience squirrels messing with it, but we'll experience winter. So
that's what happened to my
yeah.
oak acorns that
Oh,
I
yeah.
had soaked and planted, and the squirrels came along within
Yeah.
a half an hour and cleaned them all out.
Yeah.
They're
So
nice and soft too.
one thing that I did not bring, but I think I can describe, is that what I do to protect plants, either in the ground or in a pot, from squirrels, cats, and other non-humans that like to dig, is put a metal screen over it and weight it down. And there are many things that will work. Squirrels will be kept out by chicken wire that's weighted down with scrap wood and bricks. Smaller animals, it needs to be closer together, mice, rats. If you're trying to protect it from raccoons, the weight needs to be heavier because they're stronger than squirrels, but covering it with something with a metal mesh and then weighting it down works really well. Old refrigerator shelves or oven shelves work well because they're kind of heavy as well as being metal. So that's a helpful way to protect it from squirrels. So that's one way to do it. If the seeds are really, really, really precious and you have an institutional space, maybe you have some sort of protected cold space, but probably not. Or if you're just doing a very small amount of seeds, another thing that people will do is mix the seeds with moist potting soil and put them in their refrigerator or freezer. And then at some point you take them out and then they say, oh, we experienced winter and now it's spring. But probably most of us are not going to be filling our freezer with pots of soil. If you do it that way, then you don't put it in a pot, you put it in a Ziploc bag. And then you take it out of the freezer and thaw it out and then plant it in your pot. Does anyone want to practice what I just showed you?
Sure.
All right. It's all you.
I'll probably take a smaller one.
Sure.
Unless there's being safe or something.
I don't think so.
Okay. I think that's a good amount of soil.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just darker. Yeah. I think I got some. And just pat it down. Ended up a little deep there because it was only loose.
That doesn't matter.
Okay. And then it just
Into
goes.
the soaking tray.
Hope it doesn't float away.
I think it'll be. That's one of the things with the soaking thing is if the soil is bone dry and the pot is small, sometimes it does float. But no, it's well. As it wets, it'll
Yeah.
get heavier.
Yeah.
As I said, the general rule of thumb is the bigger the plant is, or the bigger the seed is, excuse me, the deeper it should get planted. But there are seeds that are bigger than this that still need sun to germinate, and so you might cover them very lightly with soil. There are also seeds like beans that you want to plant at least an inch deep. Fava bean seeds, which are really big, are a true seed, and it doesn't matter how you orient them because they're going to open up and the baby plant is in there. But garlic is not a seed, it's a plant, and it has an up and a down, and that's why that's really important. And when you're planting a garlic clove, you are essentially transplanting a plant, and that's why it's important. Is that the leaves are, the pointy part is the leaves and the flat part is the roots. And then seeds like corn, which is a monocot, it doesn't open up like this, it just has one fleshy part. It's still, there's only one hole, and the root and the leaf come out of the same hole. So that's why it doesn't matter how you orient them. That's why, you know, traditionally people would plant the corn seed by digging a hole with a stick and put the corn seed, the bean seed, and the squash seed in that hole. And they're not gonna, at least I haven't heard of anyone traditionally orienting them, but there's lots of things I don't know about. So any more things people want to say about seeds before we move on to vegetative asexual propagation?
I guess, like, what is the botanical definition of a seed?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so a seed is something that has an embryonic entire plant inside it. That's one definition. And another is that a seed is, another Latin word is a zygote, which means that it is made, now this isn't universally true, but it's something that is produced by the reproductive structures, which are usually flowers. Well, I guess by definition, a reproductive structure is a flower, even if it doesn't look like our idea of a flower. Like a cornflower is wind pollinated, so there's no flower that you can see. Walnut trees are the same way. Oak trees also, they don't have a flower that you can see. But the plant produces a structure that is specifically for reproduction, that doesn't have any other function, and a pollen grain fertilizes an ovary, and it could be inside the same flower on some plants. On other plants there's two different kinds of flowers. There's some plants where there's different kinds of flowers on different individuals. We tend to use the words in horticultural and agricultural world, we tend to use the words male and female for that, but we could come up with different words for that. But there are plant parts that produce spermatocytes, and there are plant parts that produce ova, and you have to combine them, and that will eventually turn into a seed which has an embryonic plant inside it. That is the, botanical is probably a good way to say it, definition of a seed. I was going to do cuttings next, and I'll say goldenrod is a perennial, so it can also be propagated by cuttings, but the reason we did it from seed, partly because the person who I was in contact with, who's been doing a lot of gardening here, specifically suggested it, and because it was fun to collect the tiny seeds and talk about cold stratification. But it is also a perennial and can be propagated by cuttings. But I think we're going to take that.
Can all perennials be propagated by cuttings, or is that not?
All perennials can be propagated vegetatively. A cutting, usually when we say a cutting, we're going to talk about a couple different kinds of vegetative propagation. A cutting usually means a piece of a stem. So there are perennials that don't ever make a stem. There are also leaf cuttings, so I stand corrected. You can propagate, prickly pear is an example of something you can propagate from a leaf cutting. Begonias, a lot of house plants which are really tropical rainforest plants, you can take a leaf and stick it in the ground, and you could think of that as a cutting. Yeah.
So all perennials can be propagated vegetatively?
Yes.
In regards to annuals and biennials in relation to their being propagated vegetatively, what is it more, not categorical there?
Annual plants can be propagated by cuttings, but and it might be marginally faster than growing from seed. The only annual plant I've ever seen propagated from cuttings are tomatoes, because people get really into their tomatoes. You can buy grafted tomato plants if you want to. They are commercially available. They cost a whole lot of money. I have never tried to propagate, say, kale. Well, kale is often perennial. Actually, I'm going to show you in a second. Here, let's do that. These are cuttings from my tree collard plant, which is the same species as kale and looks like the biggest kale plant in the world, but is a perennial. I'm not sure how long they can live, at least 5 years, because in our climate, sometimes they die because they get cold. So I take cuttings of them every fall just to be sure. So, but this is an example of a kale that I've taken cuttings of. So I imagine, but it's one of the many things I've never actually tried. I've never tried taking a cutting of a kale plant. Lettuce is an example of something that has no stem, so it'd be hard to take a cutting of it, or propagate it vegetatively. If you break the top off a carrot, it won't grow more leaves. So that's an example of a biennial that cannot be propagated any way other than seed. So, yeah, I think one thing is that most of the annuals that are typically grown deliberately by humans, which are either vegetables or ornamentals or both, grow pretty fast from seed. And so the reason to grow things from cuttings is if growing it from seed is really slow. Like growing a tree from seed is going to be much slower, and also with a few exceptions isn't going to breed true, which we'll talk about. Oh yeah, we should talk about that. So that's one of the reasons you propagate things vegetatively, is because seeds give you biodiversity, and all of the other plant parts throughout the plant, unless there's been a mutation in one part of the plant, they're all genetically identical. Like my little finger and my ear are genetically identical. But if I had a baby, which I can't do anymore, the baby would not be genetically identical to me. So seed is like a baby. And whereas my finger and my ear, I mean, humans, we don't grow new, you can't take my finger and grow a new human from it. But you can do that with a tree. Isn't that cool? Yeah, the main why for vegetative propagation is breeding true, and then the other main why is that you usually get a new plant faster than from planting a seed.
Yeah. I've also heard that for some, like, perennials, they might take a year or two to, like, they focus their first 2 years on growing and being established, and then year 3, 4, they dump a ton of berries. For instance, stuff like I've heard this for blueberries.
That's definitely true. Yeah, or
Yeah.
longer. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, like if you grow a rosemary bush from seed, it's gonna be like 3 years that it's this big.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
whereas you can take a cutting that's that big and root it in a month.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's talk a minute. So not everyone has space to plant a fruit tree anyway, so I mean, this class isn't really about fruit trees. There are like whole classes that are just about fruit trees, because those are for people that have a place to plant a fruit tree, which not everybody does. But the reason I was going to do the figs is because the cuttings are big and easy to look at. We could also take cuttings of the goldenrod or the motherwort, and we could take cuttings, all of those things, and I think it's probably okay. But the most fruit trees, besides the fact that they're big and not everyone has room for them, the reason that fruit trees aren't grown from seed normally is that not only will the seedling not breed true, but most of our common fruit trees are grafted, which means that the top and the roots are not genetically identical to each other. And so if you want something that makes the same kind of, if you have a fruit tree in your yard that you really love, and your friend wants to have the same fruit tree, well, it's going to take a long time, but a couple years. But if you plant a seed from your favorite apple, that tree is not going to make the same kind of apples. Whereas if you take a cutting from the tree, it will make the same kind of apples. If you plant the seed, besides getting more biodiversity, it's going to be the same as the rootstock that it grows on, which is the root part that the top part is grafted onto. But if you take a cutting at the top, then once it does turn into a tree, it will make the same kind of apples, with the caveat that in many cases an apple tree that's just a rooted cutting might not do well, because there might be something about the rootstock that makes it well adapted to the soil or the climate, or the other thing that might happen is you might get an apple tree that's 50 feet tall, because those are the old apple trees. They were 50 feet tall, and most people these days don't want one that's 50 feet tall. So those are all the reasons the fruit trees are grafted. Figs are one of the exceptions. Figs are grown from cuttings, but they're not grafted. People say they're grown on their own roots, which means they're not grown from seed. You could probably plant a fig seedling. I've never actually seen one. I don't know if the seeds that my fig tree makes are even viable, because I don't see seedlings on the ground under it. But you can definitely take a cutting and root it and get a perfectly fine fig tree. And so let's go take a cutting from the fig tree. This is Fosterville's fig tree, and when you're taking a cutting from a tree, it's an opportunity to also make a good pruning cut. I asked Rudy, who lives here, for some desires, and they said branches that are growing in the path, which is often a thing people want cut. So this branch is kind of growing in the path. And then the other thing is that I want to take it off the tree in a way that is not harmful to the tree, which pruning trees is one of the things I do for a living, and I want to make a good pruning cut. So this long branch has lots of opportunities for propagation in it. And I'm going to take it all the way off because that's the best thing. It's the best thing for the health of the tree to take it all the way off, although actually the best thing for fig production would be to cut it short. And the only thing is, figs that are down here in the shade might not ripen. I don't know. Do you want me to cut it for fig production? I'll show you both. Cutting it for fig production would mean cutting it shorter, and then it will make lots of little twigs that might make more figs next year.
Yeah.
Should I do that? Or
Yeah. Sure.
okay.
Why not?
Yeah. So cutting for tree health sometimes means taking the branch all the way off and not leaving short stubs like this. Cutting for fig production means leaving something that's short so that it will grow a lot of new shoots that will make new figs next year. But I'm still going to make a good pruning cut, by which I mean something that will heal as well as growing new shoots. You can kind of see there's thickened places with lines crossing the branch. Those are called nodes. Those are places where there's lots of genetic material that will grow and heal over. This is always a node where the new branch comes off, but then you can see all of these nodes. A place where a leaf comes off is a node. A place where there's a bud is a node. And any place that there's something else growing out of it is a node. There might be more nodes that we can't even see. So I want to make the cut just downstream from a node. So I think I'll pick that one, because then I'll make a nice little spray, and there'll be a cluster of figs here that are next to the path but not in the path. The other thing to know about making a good pruning cut, the pruners have a blade, that's the sharp part, and this other part is conventionally called the anvil. You want the blade to be touching the part of the tree that's staying, and the anvil to be touching the part that's coming off. That will make the cleanest cut that will heal best. So let's make it right here. And you're making it just outside. Okay, so there we go. Flip.
Yeah, so leave the node on the tree.
Yes, cutting just outside of the node. If I cut just inside of the node, I'd be leaving a stub that's 3/4 inches long. Thank you for that clarifying question.
So the fig's gonna bleed a bit.
Yep, they
Do
do
you
that.
have to seal the ends on them?
No, it'll heal up by itself. Actually, there's one other thing I want to show you. I can find another. Oh, figs aren't really doing this. Oh, okay. I'm gonna take one more here because I want to show you another kind of cutting. Okay. All right. So that is plenty of material. If everyone here wanted to take home 4 fig tree cuttings, this is more than enough. So,
I got
did you
one.
want to practice making a good pruning cut?
I was looking at this one because it's just growing right into the path.
Yep, sure
I'm
is.
curious if I should, anvil towards the tree.
Blade towards the tree.
Oh, blade towards the
Blade
tree.
towards the
Okay.
tree. Yeah, perfect.
And I was thinking either this node or this node.
Sure.
'Cause that'll give it plenty of space
Yep.
and the dried off twig.
Yeah, and maybe just like a 1/4 inch downstream from the node. These are prunings, or they're cuttings from that tree, but you can make them into a lot of much smaller cuttings for propagation. If you wanted to have, I'm not counting, but you know, a whole bunch of baby fig trees that make the same kind of figs as that tree, you can make a whole bunch. All the genetic material is throughout, but it's concentrated at the nodes, so you're more likely to get good root growth from nodes. So that's one thing to know. You're going to take your cutting and you're going to put it either in water or in moist soil. It doesn't have any roots, so it's much harder for the part that's in the soil to support the part that's outside of the soil. So you're going to want most of it to be in the soil. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about is rooting hormones and their analogs, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. So first I'm going to show you how to cut these things up, or how I learned to cut these things up. You want to mostly take the leaves off unless they're buried in the soil, because the leaves are going to suck moisture out of the stem, and then it's going to have a hard time. You can break them off, you can snip them off. If anyone wants to snip some leaves off some stems.
Yeah, I don't.
Right here. First, the reason that I took the second cutting is I want to show you this thing that's called a heel cutting, which is if you have a side shoot and you peel it off, not making a good pruning cut, so a good pruning cut leaves the genetic material in the part that's still attached to the tree, so it will heal over. This is already taken off the tree. So I made a good pruning cut so that would heal, but now I want to make a cutting with a high probability of making new roots. And so instead of leaving the genetic material on the main branch, I'm going to take it with me on this thing that I was taught to call a heel cutting. And so I do that not with a tool, but by peeling it off with my fingers. I think the fact that I play the guitar and I have this musician's thumbnail, but I think you can do it even without that. I feel like my musician's thumbnail makes it easier for me to make a little cut under there. But I think even, let me do it without, because I don't know if the rest of you play the guitar. I'm just so used to doing it this way. Oh, it's actually not really breaking off the way I wanted it to. You can also cut it. Yeah. So it wasn't, I wanted more of the node to come off with this. And what I just did was cut some of it off, which means it's a little bit broken from my attempt to peel it off. So it's not ideal, but it still has more of the fig tree's genetic material in that node. And so there's a bunch of things that you can do when you're propagating from cuttings that the more precious your parent plant is, the more it makes sense to do those things. I learned when I worked at Leach Botanical Garden, working with plants that were precious, and some of them were really tiny, and the cuttings were like this big, you know, they're like half an inch long. So the heel cutting is one thing I was taught. Another thing I was taught is the minimum size. So the minimum size is that you want 2 nodes below ground and 1 node above ground. You always want more below ground than above ground, because the below ground part has to support the above ground part. And then another thing I was taught was to mostly take the leaves off, but leave kind of a little fragment of leaf, which this leaf petiole is really long, but the fragment of leaf is like that. And this is from, again, from my mentor Scotty Fairchild, who, he didn't tell me a book to look this up in. He just said his experience was that having that little bit of leaf kind of let the rest of it know that it needed to start growing some roots. But not too much leaf, or the leaf was just going to suck all the life force out of it. So this is, I guess I could say it's lore. The other thing that you can do to improve the chances of an individual cutting surviving, you want to have more than one cutting, is to use some kind of rooting stimulant. And there are two broad categories of rooting stimulants, powdered and liquid. The technique depends on whether your rooting stimulant is powdered or liquid, and then within each of those categories there are lots of different things. I am going to demonstrate with this particular cutting, I'm going to demonstrate powdered when your powder is mass-produced synthetic rooting hormone. So synthetic means that it's chemically the same as the natural rooting hormones in plants. Well, there are many different natural rooting hormone components in plants, but it's chemically the same as one of them, but it didn't come from a plant. It was made in a lab. And if you're really, really purist about doing everything naturally in your life, like you don't use plastic and you don't drive cars and all those things, there are lots of natural products that will be a less powerful rooting stimulant than this. And this is, I'll say, mildly toxic. Like, you don't want to eat it, you don't want to breathe it, but like I've handled it a ton. This little jar costs $6 and it's gonna last for like 1,000 plants. So, and I'm kind of known by my friends for doing everything the most difficult way possible, but sometimes I'm just like, I got this little jar, it costs $6. Were you raising your hand? Or?
No,
okay,
I just...
yeah. And so if you're using a natural powdered rooting hormone product, I don't have direct experience with those, but I have read that cinnamon and turmeric are both less powerful but still work as rooting hormone stimulants, and they're things that we all already have in our kitchens. They're not as cheap as this stuff, but they're also non-toxic, and I mean, they also came from 10,000 miles away, but like if we're already buying them for our kitchens, yeah. So you get to decide the ethical choices you're going to make, but the technique is going to be the same.
And that was cinnamon and turmeric?
Cinnamon and turmeric and a couple others. Onion powder is another one I've heard. So with the powdered rooting hormone, you want your soil to be a little bit moist so that you can make a hole in it. And then you take your jar of rooting hormone powder, and if it was really, really, really dry, you might want to dip your cutting in some water to make sure it sticks. Oh, another thing you can do if your cutting is really, really precious is peel a little bit of the outer bark off to expose the inner bark, which is called the cambium, the green stuff that's under the brown stuff, because the brown stuff is no longer growing. It's inert. You could say it's dead. Those cells are dead. They're like our skin. They're like the outer layer of our skin. Okay, so I've got my cutting that I dipped in the water to make it a little bit moist, and I've got my dry powder of rooting hormone. And after all that talking, all I'm going to do is stick it in there, and then I tap it to make the extra fall off, and then I have my twig that has rooting hormone powder stuff on the outside, and I'm going to put it in my soil and close up my little hole. Remember how I said more below than above? There's too much above, so I'm going to cut it off above that last node. You want to make sure there's one node above ground, but if there's too many below ground, it's going to have a hard time. So much for my little piece of leaf. And there's probably, now because it's a heel cutting, it has more than just one node down there. The heel is kind of good for a couple nodes, but this is like the most conservative way to give it. Like, I'm not so sure about the leaf magic as much as making sure that there's more below ground than above ground. And then I want to put it in my soaking tray. It's not floating. Yeah. And if anyone wants, and then I'll show what you do when it's not a heel cutting. It's pretty much the same. Oh, the other thing Scotty told me, this is totally convention. It's mostly to keep track of which way is down and which way is up, although with many plants, figs being one of them, either roots or leaves can grow out of any of these nodes. Like, you can take a cutting and bury it sideways, and it'll just sort of decide which way it's going to grow. I think not all plants will do that. But the convention is that the part that's going down gets cut at an angle. And then the part that's going to be out of the ground gets cut across, kind of perpendicular to the stem. Oh, and I do want to, which the stem is curved, so perpendicular to the stem is not flat. And it's kind of arbitrary, but, so I'm just going to put this one in the water for now. Actually, I have some other water for cuttings in. So I think it's time to talk about willow and liquid, but and then we'll make more cuttings out of these. So I brought some willow stems. Oh, actually, let's look. These are tree collard cuttings that I took 2 weeks ago. It is not a controlled experiment because all of them were dipped in the powdered rooting hormone. And I just want to very gently dump them out and look at them and see if they've grown any new roots yet. And then we'll do the willow exercise.
You said it was a week ago?
2 weeks. So it usually takes about 4 weeks. And again, I'm going to just say this over and over again. You have to keep it moist. So if you're using powder as a rooting stimulant, you have to put it in soil, because if you put it in water, it'll wash the powder off. But if you're using a liquid rooting stimulant, you can keep it in water, or if you're just using water, you can keep it in water. This one, I think it does have the very beginnings of tiny, tiny new roots growing. I'm going to point at it, and then I'm going to pass it around. I mean, 2 weeks is kind of short, but I'm pointing at the base of it, and then I'll pass it around, and you can look at it. So then, yeah, willow. Willow is one of the plants that contains lots and lots and lots of natural rooting stimulant. You can take a willow stake and stick it in the ground, and it is very likely that it will grow new roots. People make these living willow structures that live, you know, it's pretty cool. They can also get out of hand if you don't maintain them, if you think it's going to be your cool little basket weaving project and then you don't prune it. But if you want a willow tree, you can just take a willow cutting and stick it in the ground. The other cool thing I learned about willow rooting hormone, let's see, where's my willow stuff? Here it is that even once the willow twigs have gotten pretty dry and maybe not even alive anymore, some of these, they're still alive. So I took these cuttings a week ago, and I had them in a bucket of water. This is the willow water. It's the water that was in the bucket that these cuttings were sitting in.
So it'll be like aspirin.
Yeah. So willow has, it's salicylic acid originally came, or aspirin originally came from willow. And apparently it's also helpful for plant growth, and there are the natural rooting hormones that are in the willow. So that's only a week old, and it was cold, so it's probably not very strong. If you want to make your willow water strong, you use either heat or more time. You can cut these up and so everything I've read says you should strip the leaves off. And I don't know why. I don't think the leaves are going to retard root growth, but maybe they'll just be in the way. So that's one of the things. Gonna wants to help me strip these leaves off. Yeah, these stems
Can we
are
just
still
leave
alive.
the leaves on
Can we
ground?
just dump the leaves on? Can we dump the leaves on the ground? Yeah. They'll become part of your mulch. Yeah, so one of the things that you can do, you can either make the willow water in one step and then drain it and put the plants in it, the plant cuttings. Or the thing that we were thinking, or that I was thinking we could do today, is to do them both at the same time.
You're good. You're good.
So what you do, and if anyone wants to practice making some cuttings, these are going to be in water. You want them to have a minimum, I think I'm going to put the water up to here, so you want them to have a minimum of 2 nodes below the water, but it might be 3, and a minimum of 1 above the water. So like this first one, just because, I think, yeah. So, every part of the willow stem, let's go back to talking about the willow and then we'll talk about the fig. Every part of the willow stem has the natural plant hormones in it that will stimulate root growth. And traditionally what people do is cut it up into pieces that are all going to be below the water. And this, if you're making it cold, it's just going to be soaking in the cold water. And then we'll put the cuttings in there. If you're making it hot, you make basically a tea out of it. You cut them up, you put them in some vessel that will not be harmed by boiling water, like not a plastic deli tub. And then you pour boiling water over it, you let it sit for at least 24 hours, and then you strain it. And then you have willow water. And you can also drink it. It's good for you. It's relaxing and helps with your aches and pains. As opposed to the stuff in the jar, which definitely don't eat it. So and I'm not making good pruning cuts. I'm making twigs for tea. I'm making tea. So this water just got dirty because I stuck my dirty fingers in it. It's only cloudy because of that. It was, water from the hose. Also because my bucket wasn't that clean. But this water was clean. I cleaned my bucket at home before I put the willow twigs in it. This is willow water that turned that color from having the willow twigs sitting in it. So this is, this is one more.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right. If somebody decides later they want to take these out, and willow, so this willow I harvested on my friend's land out in the gorge, but you can get willow in the slough too. I don't know anyone that has willow growing in their yard because it needs wet. I should say I haven't done this very much, so I couldn't really tell you what's the ideal ratio of willow twigs to water. I'm guessing this is going to be really, really strong. I've read that once you make the water, you can keep it in the refrigerator for a year, so it must have some natural preservative in it. Again, I'm sharing things I don't have direct experience with. But, so now that we've got this, now we can put our fig cuttings in it. And does anyone want to practice making some fig cuttings? So we might as well put your twigs in here for now. And then, so this one, so here's a node, here's a node, here's a node. So 3 minimum. This is going to be lots and lots of fig trees. Any questions about cutting propagation before we move on to air layering, divisions, and self-seeding? And I should say self-seeding is not vegetative propagation. Self-seeding is when a seed falls on the ground and a plant grows without human interference. And then that plant is called a volunteer. And so one of the ways to make more plants is to look around on the ground, whether it's in the yard of the place where you live, or the yard of where your friend lives, or a park, or the forest, and find seedlings and determine, if you're in the forest, you should probably make sure there's lots of whatever kind of seedling it is, so that you're collecting ethically, and whatever practice you do to ask permission, make sure that you do that. But if it's in your own place where you live, you know, and it's something like calendula, probably okay. Let's talk about air layering, and we're going to walk over to the oregano. Air layering works on many plants. It works on plants that have long stems. It particularly well works on plants that are in the mint family, which oregano is an example of. It works well on rosemary, but the rosemary plants here are not, their geometry doesn't work for this technique, so we're not going to do it with them today, but we'll do it with this oregano. And all that this means is you lay this stem on the ground. You see how, so all of these places that leaves come out of the stem are nodes. Because it's oregano, it has the potential to grow new leaves from any of those nodes. I could take a cutting, that would work fine. But this technique, which is called air layering, the difference is that I'm going to leave the stem attached to the mother plant while I wait for it to grow new roots. That's the only way that it's different. So one thing is you can look for places that the plant has done this on its own. Like with the strawberries, you dig up some babies. But if you want to do it deliberately, you lay the stem on the ground. And we're going to cover the node with soil, and the idea is that it's enough soil that the weight will just hold it down. But sometimes you have to grab a stake or something and pin it in place. But no, I think this is going to be...
So when doing strawberries, if the runner goes out and you have like 3 or 4 nodes away from the mother plant, if I put those 3 or 4 nodes in the dirt and then cut from the mother plant, they would survive?
If it's already grown roots, it's gonna have a better chance of survival. Hi! Did you come to learn about air layering? Do you like to dig in the dirt? Is that your favorite thing? You're adorable. Oh, no worries. She came to learn about air layering oregano. Yeah, so this technique, which is typically called air layering, it's still attached to the mother plant, and then once it grows new roots, then we can clip the stem and dig it up and take it somewhere else. And with the strawberries, it's the same thing. You want to cover those little babies, or not necessarily cover them, they just need to be touching the ground. And when they haven't grown new roots, the only way for them to get water is through that stem from the mother plant. And then once they grow their own roots, then usually you might notice that the stem from the mother plant dies anyway. And if it doesn't already break on its own, then you can clip it. And then yeah, if you want to dig up that baby and transplant it, that's a fine time to do it. I didn't count the number of nodes I buried, but looking at the spacing here, I'd say it's 3. And then it's gonna rain this week, so it'll be pretty moist. If it were, you know, July or August, you might want to dump some water on it to encourage the root growth. Or willow tea. Yeah, willow tea can be used for other situations where you want to stimulate root growth. If you're transplanting something and you want it to have more roots before it gets transplanted, or if you just did transplant something and you want to grow more roots, you can water it with willow tea, and then you can water your air layerings with willow tea. Yeah, use the willow tea for all your propagation needs. It doesn't work on seeds because it stimulates root growth. There are other plant hormones that stimulate seeds. We should do the divisions. The mint is over there. You could grow it from seed. That's the slowest way. You could take a cutting, and then you could do air layering. And the other thing you can do with mint, which works for many other kinds of perennials, is take a division. Oh, there we go. I just had to push those roots through the hole. And yeah. So
very root bound.
yeah, but it's mint, so it's fine. taking a division means cutting in a way that you're getting at least some underground part of the plant that has some roots on it. And in this case, I'm not gonna take the whole thing apart. I'm just gonna take this division right here and then put it back. Unless I want to take one of the motherwort. I might try to cut the motherwort out of there so we can look at it too. So
I will gladly take some mint home.
cool.
And ye shall have it forever.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean you can see these circling roots are like growing side shoots. They're trying to grow leaves. They're growing more roots. I mean it's root bound, but it's not unhappy. Whereas some plants, when they get root bound, they're unhappy.
I shall be back in a moment.
Yeah, I mean, some plants would be deeply traumatized by this treatment, but because it's a mint, I mean, if all these little fibrous roots get dried out, then it's going to have a hard time, but, in fact, I might go grab the bucket of water. You can even just rip it out of there, and because it's a mint, it'll be fine. I mean, in general, when you're taking a cutting, it means that you're kind of, excuse me, a division, it means that you're cutting part of the underground parts of the plant. Okay. So, you could define this as one division, or you could define it as multiple divisions, because it's a mint. Well, it's at least 3 distinct clusters that are not attached to each other anymore. But you can see how every one of these nodes has roots coming off of it?
And also small leaves.
And small leaves, even though it's underground. Well, I think this one was at the soil surface. They're very pale green. And then you could break these things off. Yeah, I don't want it to get too dried out. I want to cut the motherwort out of here. I'm pretty sure that taproot came from motherwort. Motherwort, similarly, is easy to well, it's in the mint family, but it does have that taproot. So, it seems like this central core is pretty solid, though. So, I don't really feel the need to mess with it. One thing to know about motherwort in particular is that its spent flower pods, these things right here, are quite spiky. They will poke you. Even when you're making tea, if you harvest your motherwort in flower and you dry it, when you're putting the little clipped parts of the flowering stem into your teapot, it will hurt. So I try to be aware of that. I think this is probably enough. What I'm going to do is go put these in the bucket of water and then put this, or would someone like to put this back in the pot?
I can help, yeah.
Thank you so much. You could propagate these cuttings by sticking them in moist soil, or moist soil with rooting hormone, or willow water, whatever. Or you could say, I'm going to harvest some mint here. Or you could say, I'm going to have some really good smelling compost. But whatever you do, I'll show kind of like the maximum. And I'm not being super careful about good pruning cuts because it's mint. It's not going to die because I left stubs on it. You know. I have kind of an aesthetic preference for not leaving the stubs, even on plants that don't, when the plant itself doesn't care, I care.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's a pretty balanced ratio of, in fact, it's fairly conservative ratio of top to roots, because it's got all these roots here. Now, if we're going to leave this long thing, which means to fit in most pots, it is going to curl around, but it's mint, so it'll be fine. And this is actually two, no, this is, without more cutting or breaking, this is one division, but if you really, if mint felt like a scarce resource, you could make this into two. This kind of naturally stays as one. And I think there was, oh, there's the other one. This one, it turns out, has roots but no leaves, which is fine. Mint is one of the plants where you could have just taken one of those little sections of roots and stuck it, and there's many plants like this, and stuck it in either water or moist soil, and it will grow more roots and a new top. So, mint is tough. Yeah, and then these, as I said, you could dry them for tea, you could try to sprout them, try to root them, or you could let them be compost. This is a division that I took, oh God, a few months ago by accident while weeding, of checker mallow, which is a plant indigenous to this bioregion and an important food for butterflies. And I was thinking of very gently dumping it out of its pots and looking at what roots it's grown. Yeah, because it has some roots coming out the bottom of the pot, and it doesn't have any weeds growing in it, which makes me think it's kind of okay. And then I'm going to leave this plant here so that Fosterville can be feeding the butterflies.